The U.S. bishops met in Baltimore this week for their fall meeting. Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas, will offer his analysis. And the House Democrats' impeachment inquiry began public hearings this week. Were impeachable offenses discovered? Member of the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jim SENSENBRENNER, is here with his analysis. Finally, is religious liberty in America under attack? Becket Fund senior counsel and author of the new book, Free to Believe, Luke Goodrich, will tell us. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. We've got a great show for you tonight. Bishop Joseph Strickland, Congressman Jim SENSENBRENNER, and Luke Goodrich are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover. First, some news for you. The Australian High Court announced Tuesday that Cardinal George Pell has been granted leave to appeal his conviction for child sexual abuse. The cardinal was convicted last December on charges that he sexually abused two choir boys after Sunday Mass while Archbishop of Melbourne. He has strenuously denied those charges. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and must serve at least 3 of those years and 8 months before being eligible for parole. The 78-year-old cardinal, who remains an archbishop and a member of the College of Cardinals, has been held in solitary confinement and has not been permitted to celebrate Mass in prison. Cardinal Pell has maintained his innocence. His appeal to the High Court was his last legal avenue to overturn his conviction. The new appeal will be heard next year in Australia's High Court. Also this week, Pope Francis appointed a fellow Jesuit, Father Juan Antonio Guarroro Alves, a 60-year-old Spanish economist, to replace Pell as the Vatican's finance minister. And reports from Rome indicate that the resignation of Bishop Richard Malone of Buffalo, New York, may be imminent. The UK tablet is reporting that Malone may soon be stepping down in the wake of accusations that he's mishandled the abuse crisis in the Diocese of Buffalo. Bishop Malone is now in Rome with other New York bishops for their ad limina visit with Pope Francis. Malone's resignation, if true, would have to be accepted by Pope Francis, and according to the tablet, the papal nuncio in the U.S., Archbishop Christophe Pierre, has been informed of the resignation and is in favor of it. A spokesman for the Diocese of Buffalo said this week they have received no information about the resignation. We'll continue to report on this story as it develops. Well, the USCCB, the Bishops' Conference, met this week in Baltimore for their annual fall assembly. The bishops discussed a host of issues, including abortion, gun control, gun violence, immigration, and evangelization. They also elected a new president to the conference, Los Angeles Archbishop Jose Gomez, who will succeed Cardinal Daniel DiNardo of Galveston, Houston. This year's fall meeting was not without controversy. So joining me this evening to recap some of the highlights is one of its participants, Bishop Joseph Strickland of the Diocese of Tyler, Texas. He joins us from Baltimore. Your Excellency, thank you for being here. I want to start with the opening address by the papal nuncio, Christophe Pierre, on Monday. He had this to say about the U.S. bishops and their communion with Pope Francis. Watch.
The pastoral trust of this pontificate must reach the American people, especially as families continue to demand of dioceses and parishes the accompaniment and vision by Amoris Laetitia.
Now, the nuncio is really pressing there for the implementation in the U.S. of Amoris Laetitia. That was the controversial papal exhortation that permits divorcees without annulment to return to communion. Now, Bishop, how did you and your brother bishops receive that message? It was pretty blunt.
Well, as I sat there in the hall with my brother bishops, it didn't seem to have the impact for me personally, honestly, or the other bishops that some of the press has picked up on. It seemed pretty much in line with similar addresses that I've heard before. And in talking to other bishops, that seemed to be the tone. Certainly, those that you just quoted, the nuncio's words about Amoris Laetitia, encouraging that. And I think there's much that we have embraced in our diocese, and I think many other bishops as well. I think some of the press may be hearing it as the specific dubia or the questions about that document that certainly are still sort of in the realm of confusion, but it's really not confusing for me, and I've made it clear to the priests that there's really been, certainly we want to accompany people, we want to reach out. We've actually got a program in the diocese working with people that are in irregular marriages and really trying to reach out to them. So I think that is very much in the spirit of Amoris Laetitia and what we keep hearing beautifully from Pope Francis, reaching out to the people, going out to the margins. We're really trying to do that without changing and pulling back from what continues to be canon law and the teaching of the Church regarding what is a valid marriage. So I guess I heard it through a different kind of mixing metaphors, but a different lens.
Well, you're
with,
seeing it.
How I heard it because of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, you're experiencing it from your lived experience in the diocese, which is the right way to receive it, I think. He went on to say this, the nuncio did, about the U.S. bishops' ad limina visits that are getting underway with Pope Francis in Rome. Listen.
It may be useful and prayerfully reflect on the gift of communion with the Bishop of Rome, namely by measuring to what extent we as individuals and our local churches have received the magisterium of Pope Francis. By now, Evangelii Gaudium should be the framework for effort at evangelization. Adopting its missionary impulse and being in a permanent state of mission might represent tangible signs of communion with the Holy Father.
He refers there, Bishop, to the magisterium of Pope Francis. There seems to be a concern that the bishops are not in step with the Pope. What did you make of that suggestion?
Well, I certainly heard the encouragement, and from everything I heard at the conference this week, especially Bishop Barron's presentation on reaching out to the nuns, those who have walked away from the church, as he said, beginning at age 13, we're losing young people. So in that sense, I think there are great efforts to, as I would describe, I mean, there are many things that Pope Francis has said, but I think a basic thrust is to go to the margins, go to the disenfranchised. And what I hear, and in the presentations, a real effort to do that. I think sometimes there are differences in what we're bringing maybe to those margins. And I try to emphasize guarding the deposit of faith and bringing the richness of the faith to those margins. But I really, in talking to other bishops, and like I said with Bishop Barron's presentation, I see a great focus, and there was a great energy in the room during Bishop Barron's presentation, really saying we need to not water down the faith. That was the third point that he made, and really reach out. So I think there is a buzz, in a sense, that reaching out but kind of leaving behind the message of the gospel. But really, we haven't heard that from Pope Francis. I mean, there are things that are confusing, and I would ask for more clarity on exactly what we are called to do. But I think we have heard, and we certainly have tried to implement in the diocese, reaching out in various ways to bring the richness of the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Later on, Bishop, in the meeting, the issue of abortion came up in the context of the faithful citizenship document that the bishops routinely issue before elections. Here's how San Diego Bishop Robert McElroy raised it.
What has been added to this letter that was not in the previous forms is a statement I believe is at least discordant with the Pope's teaching, if not inconsistent. It is not Catholic teaching that abortion is the preeminent issue that we face as a world in Catholic social teaching. It is not. I think it's a grave disservice to our people if we're trying to communicate to them what the magisterium teaches.
I absolutely think preeminent needs to stay.
I am against anyone stating that our saying it's preeminent is contrary to the teaching of the Pope, because that isn't true. It sets an artificial battle between the Bishops' Conference of the United States and the Holy Father, which isn't true. So I don't like the argument Bishop McElroy used. It isn't true. You know, we do support the Holy Father completely. What he said is true, but I think it has been very clearly the articulated opinion of the Bishops' Conference for many years that pro-life is still the preeminent issue. It doesn't mean the others aren't equal in dignity. It's just time in the certain circumstances of our church in the United States.
Were you shocked by that?
Well, I would have to say I was surprised, and it concerned me because it speaks of divisions that we try to overcome in the body of the bishops, and we're called to seek unity. But I think that's an illustration of some very different ideas. And as Archbishop Chaput said so eloquently, I just said a few words, but he eloquently said what I could have said if I had spoken longer. And I guess I like the word preeminent, and I would put it alongside preborn. Those who are unborn are the preeminent issue. That's where life begins. As I've said in so many different settings in my diocese, if a child can't be born, then what rights are they going to be concerned about? They're dead before they leave the womb. They don't have to worry about borders or racism or any of the other issues that are absolutely we need to address in our broken society. But to me, it needs to be, as I said, preeminently the protection of the unborn is the very first front line of dealing with the sanctity of life. And as I've tried to say to others, when that isn't there, as Mother Teresa, St. Teresa of Calcutta said so beautifully, when you're not protecting the unborn, you can expect violence and murders and all the things that we see happening with hatred of each other, too much unfolding, even within families and within communities, and certainly nation to nation.
Bishop,
and if you're not, if the sanctity of the life of the unborn isn't there, then there's no sanctity of life. And sadly, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something that Archbishop Chaput said there a moment ago. There is this narrative being spun that when one is faithful to traditional teachings, you are somehow being disloyal to the Pope. Did you feel that tension during this conference at all? Did your confreres feel it?
Not, honestly, not a lot. It probably, the most tension I felt was in that whole question of the, preeminence of the issue of abortion. Otherwise, I haven't seen that in any real direct way. And as a bishop, as I've tried to say in social media, I'm a Catholic bishop. Of course, I support the Vicar of Christ in Rome, the Holy Father. There's a lot of confusion, and I try to hold off on judgments to get clarity on what's being said sometimes. It's a confusing world we live in. It's certainly, Rome is not the single source of confusion, but there is confusion there. Yeah. There is a lack of clarity. So I would love to see more clarity, but how can there be a discrepancy between the sacred deposit of faith that talks about the sanctity of life, male and female he created them, and there's many things in the deposit of faith, and certainly the Vicar of Christ supports those. I mean, by definition, that's who he is. I think the greater clarity that we can have is going to be beneficial.
Yeah, there does seem to be this idea, and it emerged at different moments during the conference, an attempt to elevate immigration, environmental issues, these other issues, to the same level as the life issue, this being a revival of the old Bernardine seamless garment vision. The bishops discussed migration at one point, and as I've reported for many years, the conference has, for decades, relied upon federal grants, particularly for migration, resettlement, and refugee services, to keep the bureaucracy afloat in D.C. Archbishop Dennis Schnurr had this to say about refugee levels and the impact it's had on the conference.
Migration and Refugee Services continues to downward adjust their budget to reflect the decline in the number of refugees entering our country. In 2016, MRS settled approximately 24,000 refugees. In 2017, they resettled about 7,800 refugees. In 2018, the number dropped to about 4,700. And in 2019, as of September the 30th, the number was 4,350. Staff remains vigilant and, whenever possible, proactive in pushing for more favorable federal policies.
I want to give the audience a better idea of the amount the USCCB receives in federal grants. The USCCB's Migration and Refugee Services offices received in fiscal year 2018 $47.7 million. Since fiscal year 2008, MRS has taken in over $742 million. And if you look at all the federal grant money collected by the USCCB for all its various services, we're talking $363 million in 2018, $531 million in 2017. And if you look back to 2008, the USCCB has taken in over $4 billion from the federal government. That data comes from Capital Research Center here in Washington, D.C. Bishop, quick question. With billions on the line in federal grants, have the bishops become too attached to those funds, and particularly to this issue of refugee resettlement? And we can get further into it, but I want your quick reaction to that.
Well, I honestly don't know a lot about the financial elements, but I would encourage us to certainly humanitarian crises, and there are more than one crisis in the world these days, even with the United States. I mean, you look at Venezuela, you look at many places in the world where humanitarian issues are foremost.
Sure.
I would hope that we can focus on that. And as far as the finances of it, I really don't have enough information to speak very intelligently, I have to admit. But I think we as bishops need to go back to our mission, which is, as I've said, the salvation of souls. And that is not some otherworldly focus totally. The salvation of souls happens beginning with life in the womb, and then with all the different issues that need to be navigated for a person of Christian virtue to live in this world. So all the issues are important, but I think that what I would hope we can do as a conference is more and more focus on that ultimate goal of the salvation of souls, and how do we guide people in gospel virtue to really address these issues and recognize that as bishops, it's our main job to move hearts to Christ. And if those hearts are deeply committed to Jesus Christ, He's the one that's told us how do we act, how do we treat the immigrant, how do we treat the poor, how do we treat those who have been disenfranchised. We reach out to them in the love of God and the mercy of Jesus Christ. That, I think, is what we need to focus on, is changing hearts to Christ. And then the good work that He calls us to do, each individually. I'm just a sinful man like every bishop and every human being. We are all in need of that salvation that Christ offers, and then to do the good works of justice and charity in His name.
Bishop, as you heard from Bishop Schnurr earlier, I think what concerns the laity is when you hear lines like, staff will continue to push as proactively as possible for more favorable federal policies. And look, as you said a moment ago, the poor in body and spirit. That is the obligation, the responsibility, and duty of the church to care for man in temporally and spiritually. And refugee status is a prudential judgment of governments, not churches. But the church is correct, I think, in wanting to help the stranger. And I've argued for more Christian refugees from the Middle East, for instance, because these are people actually fleeing religious persecution, not economic hardship. And I think the conference has become almost, they've become very zealous about migration policy and muted their voices in other areas, particularly on the life issue, marriage, some of these other things that, frankly, the laity is crying out for.
Well, I agree, and it is difficult. I mean, as a bishop for almost 7 years now, it's challenging to deal with a multiplicity of critical issues, but that's part of what shepherding has to be. We have to try to address all of them and guide people's hearts. I guess that's what I keep going back to, because we can't do it. We're not a policy arm of the government or of anything. We're spiritual men guiding and shepherding in the way of Jesus Christ. So changing hearts is the way we can change all these issues that need to be addressed by the good people that we serve in the life of the church.
Bishop Joseph Strickland, thank you so much for joining us. What was your final takeaway from this? What did you learn here or see here that surprised you most in this week?
I guess I'd have to say that I think there is concern about focus, and there are some divisions. That the body of Christ, yes, it's divided. I mean, certainly there's division in the church. There's bound to be some division among the bishops, but let's work toward unity in Christ. He prays for unity in his body. And that's what we always have to work toward, understanding each other. And I did see some good steps in that direction with some of the things said in public, and also just in the conversations with bishops at coffee breaks and all, with a desire to, the world has so many broken aspects that need to be addressed in just humanity. They're all God's people. It's not just a segment that we're dealing with or that we should be seeking to address. Every person, every child is a child of God's.
Thank you, Bishop Strickland. We'll check in with you soon.
Okay. God bless, Raymond.
Thank you. Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner is up next. But first, some more news. An Armenian Catholic priest and his father were gunned down as they were traveling in a car in northeastern Syria on Monday. ISIS has claimed responsibility for the attack. Father Josep Bedoyan was the head of the Armenian Catholic community in the Kurdish-majority city of Kamishli. The men were on their way to oversee the restoration of a church. Pope Francis expressed solidarity with the Armenian Catholic Christians in Syria over the murders. Also on Monday, 2 separate bombings in Kamishli killed at least 6 people and wounded 22 others. The Armenian Catholic community in Syria goes back centuries. Today, it includes some 600,000 faithful. And protests against social inequality continue after almost a month in Chile. On Tuesday, huge demonstrations and a national strike brought much of the country to a standstill. Chile is one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, but there's wide disparity between rich and poor. A student protest over rising subway fares in October has grown into a broad movement demanding reforms to education, health care, and pensions. Last Friday, an estimated 75,000 people had gathered in a Santiago square to protest the ruling government of President Sebastián Piñera. Crowds stormed La Asunción Church, removing pews, statues, and other religious icons, setting them on fire. The bishops of Chile condemned the attack, asking for peace and calm. Over 20 people have died, and at least 2,500 others have been injured in the violence. Back in the States, the United States House of Representatives impeachment probe began its first public hearings this week. The chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, kicked off the proceedings on Wednesday, but will he and House Democrats be able to make the case for the impeachment of President Trump? Here to talk about what's transpired so far and to give us his analysis of the process is member of the House Judiciary Committee, Wisconsin Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner. Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Raymond.
Now, Congressman, you went through this impeachment process almost 21 years ago with the Clinton impeachment. I need to ask you off the top, why is the Intelligence Committee and not the Judiciary conducting these hearings? And what's the difference for our viewers?
Well, Adam Schiff, I guess, was named by Pelosi as the point person for the impeachment inquiry. Ordinarily, the Judiciary Committee, which under House rules has got jurisdiction over impeachments, would be dealing with this as we have in the past. But apparently, Mrs. Pelosi decided that Chairman Nadler of New York was not the person to lead the charge against the president. What I can say is that Schiff has repeatedly lied to the American people, and everything we heard yesterday from Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Kent was all hearsay, and it couldn't be introduced as evidence in any civil or criminal proceedings in any court in the United States.
Congressman, the Democrats are attempting to prove a quid pro quo between President Trump and the Ukrainian president. In his opening statement, Adam Schiff zeroed in on public admissions by Mick Mulvaney. During a White House press briefing, the acting chief of staff said, "I have news for everybody," and he's referring to that call with the Ukrainian president. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. That is going to happen. Now, Schiff had this to say about Mulvaney's statement.
If we find that the President of the United States abused his power and invited foreign interference in our elections, or if he sought to condition, coerce, extort, or bribe an ally into conducting investigations to aid his reelection campaign and did so by withholding official acts, a White House meeting, or hundreds of millions of dollars of needed military aid, must we simply get over it? Is this what Americans should now expect from their president? If this is not impeachable conduct, what is?
Congressman Sensenbrenner, your reaction, first of all.
First, the transcript that was publicly released of President Trump's call with Ukrainian President Zelensky has no mention of the aid at all. We have found out that the Ukrainians were not aware that the aid was being held up. After the phone call, the aid was released. So the Ukrainians got the aid, and they're going to be able to better resist the Russians who occupy the eastern third of their country. But go back and look at what Biden did. Biden was bragging about holding up aid until the prosecutor that was looking into the Burisma Energy Company was fired. And look, he used kind of a bad word and said within 8 hours the prosecutor was fired. Now, that was a quid pro quo. But let me get to quid pro quos in general. The American people, when we give out aid, whether it is foreign aid or domestic aid, expect people to do something that advances our government's objectives in exchange for the aid. The aid is not a charitable contribution. And the sooner everybody recognizes it, we ought to we're the ones that ought to get over it. You know, finally, Ukraine is probably the most corrupt country in Europe. And I think every American, and hopefully including Adam Schiff, don't want to have our money being sent for a specific purpose, meaning weapons, and ending up in some corrupt Ukrainian's pocket or Swiss bank account. That would be letting down the hard-earned taxpayers' money that was being given to the Ukraine. And we should apply that across the board. You got corruption, no aid. You get rid of the corruption, we'll send the aid. I think that is a fair assessment of what the United States government, led by its president, ought to be doing.
Now, Congressman, I've heard repeatedly the Biden case that you raised a moment ago. People say, well, wait a minute. Multiple countries, including the American government at the time, the Obama administration, they all wanted this prosecutor out of business in Ukraine. And so that was extending and furthering American interests. They charged what President Trump was doing was furthering his own political interests.
Well, both of these issues related to corruption. I can say that given the fact that the aid wasn't talked about and the phone call that Schiff and others are using to try to get rid of the president, I think is something that is extremely material. Now, with Biden getting up and bragging about conditioning the aid on firing the prosecutor, I guess what the message is that if you don't want to have your activities looked at, announced you're running for president on the Democratic ticket, and that gives you virtual immunity on what you've done in the past. That's a bunch of bunk.
What is the predicate? And I want to remind people, we heard Schiff there mention coercion, extortion, and bribery. What is the predicate for those charges? Do you see those charges being properly laid out or proven at this point?
No, they aren't properly laid out. There is no evidence except hearsay that indicates any of those things occurred. And the thing is let's get real. Next year is an election year. The Senate is not going to have a trial until after the first of the year. And don't people think that it is better a year from now to have the American people decide whether Donald Trump should stay as president rather than having a bunch of politicians who's hated him from the start make that decision by kicking him out of office for basically saying a few words to President Zelensky, will you do me a favor? And that's what this whole shebang involves.
The moment being sold as a bombshell was when Ambassador William Taylor testified the other day that the president was overheard by a member of his staff on a July 26th phone call asking the EU ambassador, Gordon Sondland, about the investigations. Listen.
The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for. At the time I gave my deposition on October 22nd, I was not aware of this information. I'm including it here for completeness.
Now, this was sold as a bombshell, Congressman. Is it? Did this change anything?
No, it didn't change anything, and it's a fizzle. Now, if I can put my lawyer's hat on for a moment, one is that it's hearsay, and Taylor said so. But second, there is a rule in court that it's the best evidence that has to be presented. The best evidence are not what somebody has heard that somebody else may have said, but the people who actually said it or heard the call. That's not what this bombshell is. I think they better put another fuse in their bomb if they want to use that.
Congressman SENSENBRENNER, what is the difference in the way this process is being executed as compared to the one you led during the Clinton impeachment? And is this whole affair too granular and confusing, frankly, to arrest the attention of the American people?
The American people are getting pretty bored about this going on and on and on and on. I can say that 21 years ago, when I led the drive against President Clinton, we gave President Clinton every break and every due process requirement to allow him to present evidence. Schiff is not allowing the president to submit evidence in his defense. Now, how can you have a trial if you only hear one side of the story? And what Schiff is doing through his selective leaks in the quote closed hearings unquote, as well as the public hearings that we are now being treated to, is to let the American people know one side of the story. Joseph Stalin, as he's roasting in hell, should be smiling today.
The Republicans argue, Congressman, that the two witnesses, Taylor and Kent, have second and third-hand knowledge of these calls between the president and the Ukrainian President Zelensky. Here's Congressman Jim Jordan. Watch this.
We got 6 people having 4 conversations in one sentence, and you just told me this is where you got your clear understanding. Which, I mean, even though you had 3 opportunities with President Zelensky for him to tell you, you know what, We're going to do these investigations to get the aid. Didn't tell you 3 different times. Never makes an announcement, never tweets about it, never does a CNN interview. Ambassador, you weren't on the call, were you? You didn't listen on President Trump's call and President Zelensky's call?
I did not.
You've never talked with Chief of Staff Mulvaney?
I never did.
You never met the president?
That's correct.
You had 3 meetings again with Zelensky and it didn't come up.
And 2 of those they had never heard about, as far as I know.
And President
There was no reason for it to
President
come up.
Zelensky never made an announcement. This is what I can't believe. And you're their star witness. You're their first witness.
Mr.
You're the
Jordan,
guy. You're the guy based on this. Based on, I mean, I've seen church prayer chains that are easier to understand than this.
Congressman Sensenbrenner, what did Jim Jordan discover there?
What Jim Jordan discovered is this is all hearsay. Somebody said something and somebody overheard it and said something else to somebody else to somebody else. You know, and again, if someone presents that kind of evidence in a civil or criminal trial in any court in the United States, that evidence is going to get thrown out. And for Schiff and Pelosi and company to try to use evidence like that to overturn an election where Donald J. Trump was duly elected as president of the United States is shocking. And, you know, granted, I know that the other side really doesn't like to listen to evidence that they don't like. But American people are fair people. And just being told one side of the story is something that a totalitarian regime would do. It's time for them to grow up, it's time for them to quit it, and it's time for them to start dealing with things that the American people are really interested in, like reducing prescription drug prices and then creating jobs through the ratification of the free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico.
You know, I watched the entire hearing the other day, and at the bottom of this, I think what you're left with is, what was the president's intent? Was he asking the Ukrainians to investigate based on questions of corruption in that country involving American figures, including the Bidens? Or was he conniving with the Ukrainians to get them to investigate the Bidens for his own political purpose? But I don't know how you prove that. How do you prove the intention and the heart of somebody on the phone?
You can't do that. And, you know, that's why courts require live witnesses in the so-called best evidence rule, so that the jury, in this case the jury is the American people, can actually see their demeanor as they are testifying. Adam Schiff is not giving the American people that opportunity to look at the demeanor and talking about third and fourth hand recollections of somebody who may be listening in on a phone conversation. That's just wrong.
Yeah, NBC News, Congressman, they had a headline that said the 2-star witnesses lack pizzazz, you know, in the eyes of the American people. I mean, when I covered the Clinton impeachment march, I remember you from those days, and what you had there was, first of all, an explosive sexual scandal that then became a question of perjury. Did the president perjure himself? And the House determined he did. But that focused, I think, the mind of Americans. You heard them talking about it at bars and at schools and all over the country. This doesn't seem to have that kind of enthusiasm or vibe about it.
No, it doesn't. You know, one of the reasons why both the Clinton and Nixon impeachments went further is that there was an independent counsel who did the investigation and forwarded his findings to the House of Representatives. And Starr actually said that in 4 cases, the president may have committed an impeachable offense, recognizing that it's only the House of Representatives that can determine that under the Constitution. Now, here we had Mr. Mueller as a special counsel, and he submitted his report that said nothing. Mr. Nadler and the Judiciary Committee had Mr. Mueller before us for a number of hours. There was no smoking gun there, and as a result, you don't hear many of the Democrats talking about the Mueller report anymore, because the Mueller report said no collusion, no obstruction.
Now, Republicans have asked that the whistleblower who triggered this Ukrainian inquiry, which became the impeachment inquiry, they want that whistleblower to come forward and testify. Now, Adam Schiff has so far said no, he will not grant that request. Does it matter if the whistleblower testifies? And Do you believe Schiff had contact, or his staff, with that whistleblower? He claims no.
Well, I can't say whether he's telling the truth or not, because what Schiff has been saying for over a year now, it's been a mixed bag on that. What I can say is, yeah, the whistleblower ought to come and testify. The whistleblower is the initial complaining witness. And you can talk to any prosecutor in the country, and Schiff was one of them once upon a time, is saying if you can't get the complaining witness to come and testify, you got no case.
I want to go back to one quick point before I let you go. Just wrap this up for me. Do you see anything that emerged this week that you believe will rise to the level of an impeachable offense against Donald Trump?
Absolutely not. I haven't seen anything that rises to the level of an impeachable offense in almost 3 years of investigation by people who couldn't believe that Trump was elected in the first place. They omit wondering why they lost that election, which would be very instructive to them, in my opinion. And they've been grasping at straws to find something impeachable. They've struck out. They're on about strike 6 now.
Wow. Prior to the start of these public hearings, an NBC Wall Street Journal poll found that 49% of Americans believe the president should be impeached. Now, that's before they heard any evidence, while 46% said he should not be impeached. It doesn't seem that these hearings changed many people's minds either.
Well, no, I don't think so. What I can say is it doesn't surprise me that the poll had that result because Schiff, during his secret hearings, which weren't so secret, ended up coming up with a bunch of leaks that were all one-sided. And when you hear one side of the story for weeks on end, of course, you're inclined to believe it. We still aren't able to allow the president to submit his own defense. The Republican witnesses were by and large turned down. The president's counsel has not been able to cross-examine witnesses. And at least during a trial in court, and this is kind of a trial, whether one wants to describe it or not, with very, very high stakes, the jury listens to both sides of the argument before reaching a conclusion. Adam Schiff does not let the American people hear both sides of the argument. Then there are polls that are taken that show that there is a split verdict. There are some people who didn't vote for Trump in the beginning that wished he wasn't around. That reverses the result of the majority of the American people through the Electoral College that ended up duly electing Donald Trump as President of the United States 3 years ago.
Yeah. Congressman Jim SENSENBRENNER, we will leave it there. We will check in with you in the days ahead. Thank you for your time.
I'm here. Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you. It seems more and more individuals, corporations, and groups with sincerely held religious beliefs are coming under attack for taking positions contrary to the orthodoxy we see in the wider culture. Is a war against religious freedom being waged here in the United States? My next guest thinks it could be the case. He's vice president and senior counsel at the Becket Fund and author of the book Free to Believe, The Battle Over Religious Liberty in America. I spoke with him recently here in Washington. Here's my interview with Luke Goodrich. I want to start with this before getting to your incredible book. I just mentioned the recent case of a presidential candidate calling for the end of tax-exempt status for religious institutions who do not support same-sex marriage. Here is Beto O'Rourke at the LGBT town hall last week. This is CNN's town hall. Watch.
There can be no reward, no benefit, no tax break for anyone or any institution, any organization in America that denies the full human rights and the full civil rights of every single one of us. And so as president, we're going to make that a priority, and we are going to stop those who are infringing upon the human rights of our fellow Americans.
Luke, your reaction to what Mr. O'Rourke seems to be proposing there, and is this attitude toward religion on the rise in the work that you do defending religious liberty?
Absolutely. Beto's comments are really a frontal assault on religious freedom, but for anybody who's been paying attention, they're really par for the course. A lot of progressives have been trying to liken traditional religious beliefs to a form of bigotry, comparing them oftentimes to racism, and then seeking to use all the powers of the federal government to stamp out those beliefs. So his comments are deeply concerning, but they're also not actually that new.
Luke, Attorney General Bill Barr made headlines this week after speaking on secularism at the University of Notre Dame. I want to play some of his comments and get your reaction. Watch.
Secularists and their allies have marshaled all the forces of mass communication, popular culture, the entertainment industry, and academia in an unremitting assault on religion and traditional values. These instruments are used not only to affirmatively promote secular orthodoxy, but also to drown out and silence opposing voices and to attack viciously and hold up to ridicule any dissidents.
Luke, your reaction to that? It almost sounds like he's talking about a culture war.
Yeah, I think Attorney General Barr really hit the nail on the head, and our culture has shifted dramatically in the last 25 and even 5 years to where traditional religious beliefs that were once broadly accepted throughout our culture are now viewed as a threat to modern culture. And you see progressives increasingly trying to stamp those religious beliefs out. So I think it's very important that Attorney General Barr is calling this out, and the reaction on the left shows that he was really over the target here.
Now, Luke, I want people to understand you really are the foremost expert in this area. You defended the Hobby Lobby, the Green family in the Hobby Lobby case, the Little Sisters of the Poor. You've been on the leading edge of defending religious schools who are feeling their rights being infringed upon. And Barr called out these attacks on religion in schools particularly, government interfering in the teaching of passing faith along to kids. Here's what he said.
Ground zero for these attacks on religion are the schools. And to me, this is the most serious challenge to religious liberty today. For anyone who has a religious faith, by far the most important part of exercising that faith is teaching that religion to your children. The passing on of the faith. There is no greater gift we can give our children and no greater expression of love. And for the government to interfere in that process is a monstrous invasion of religious liberty.
Luke, are you seeing more cases like this where schools you're representing are facing greater threats from government intrusion?
Absolutely. I'm representing 3 schools right now in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, and those schools are Catholic. They teach Catholic values to children, and they had 3 educators in those schools enter same-sex marriages in clear violation of their own employment contracts and in violation of Catholic teaching. And yet those teachers are now suing the Catholic schools, trying to soak them for hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars in damages. And these sorts of threats are multiplying across the country. So that's why it's critical to stand up for the rights of all religious organizations, especially religious schools, to teach in accordance with their religious values.
Going back to that equality town hall that CNN held earlier in the week, Beto O'Rourke and Julian Castro both issued, Cory Booker as well, they all issued almost threats to those who don't adhere to a particular organization, Human Rights Campaign vision of marriage, love, what a family should constitute, and that they would penalize religious believers should they deviate from that. Now, there's been some back off in the ensuing days. Elizabeth Warren and others have said, no, that's not really what we meant. People can believe what they want to believe. But everyone on that stage, every Democratic candidate, are supporters of the Equality Act, which was passed by Congress in May. Tell me what the Equality Act would mean practically in the lives of Americans.
Yeah, the Equality Act is an aggressive attempt to advance gay rights across all areas of human life: employment, housing, public accommodations, and it includes no exemptions whatsoever for religious organizations or religious liberty. And so this conflict between the advance of gay rights and religious liberty is really one of the biggest religious freedom issues today. And the real question at stake, Americans are deeply divided on questions of sex and religion. And the question is the government going to pick one side of the debate on human sexuality and then crush and punish everyone who dissents? Or is the government going to find a way to respect both sides of this debate and allow everyone to live together in peace?
Can you respect both sides of this debate? Or is there a clash of rights here? I mean, I had an attorney this week I had a conversation with, and he said basically what people like you, Luke, are doing, you want to codify discrimination into the code and not allow these people to love who they want to love and marry who they want to marry. What would you say to that?
Yeah, the religious organizations that I'm representing are not trying to stop anyone from marrying. I mean, right now, I'm helping represent Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia. And for over 100 years, Catholic Social Services has been recruiting families to provide loving homes for foster children. But the city of Philadelphia recently decided to shut down Catholic Social Services solely because it doesn't place children with same-sex couples. But the fact of the matter is, no same-sex couple has ever come to Catholic Social Services and asked for placement, and there are over a dozen other adoption agencies in Philadelphia that do precisely that work for same-sex couples. So the question is simply, will the government live and let live? Will it let Catholic organizations like this, that have been doing this work since long before the city of Philadelphia even got involved, will it let them continue doing that work and continue providing loving homes for needy families?
I want to talk about the Little Sisters of the Poor for a moment. You've been representing them. They're back in court, which I find unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about a, 2016 Obama-era rule, HHS rule, which compelled all employers to provide contraceptives and abortifacients to their employees. Now, the nuns got they wanted repeated victories in the courts. You had the Trump administration come to power. They changed the rule in question. Why are you still in court?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I ask myself the same question just about every day. But the problem is you have several attorney generals in blue states that simply won't leave the Little Sisters alone. And so they've sued the Trump administration, arguing that the religious exemption that the Trump administration adopted is somehow unlawful and unconstitutional. So we are back in court again on behalf of the Little Sisters of the Poor, making the same argument that the government does not need to use nuns to give out contraception and abortion-causing drugs. And we've appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I feel very confident that we are going to win this case again. And once and for all, the Little Sisters of the Poor are going to be allowed to get back doing what they do best, caring for the elderly poor.
You know, Luke, I was on Fox News this week, and I pointed this out, that it shows you the long arm of bureaucracy, that even when you win, even when rules are changed, the person at the citizen is still subjected to the heavy boot of bureaucracy. It doesn't go away, particularly in this area of religious liberty. It sometimes takes an awful long time for the gears of justice to grind in the direction of justice.
That's absolutely right, and we've seen that historically as well. I go into this at length in my book, but the fact of the matter is religious freedom in this country was not won without cost. It was won by people of faith who were sticking to their conscience, even in the face of tremendous government oppression, just like the Little Sisters of the Poor. And they stuck to their conscience, and they ultimately prevailed. And so that's what we're doing. We're just coming alongside. That's the joy of my job, is I get to come alongside people of faith like the Little Sisters, and simply take a stand for them. And at the end of the day, we are going to win.
Luke, you write in the book, in Free to Believe, you identify 5 areas that exhibit the greatest challenge to religious liberty today. Let's address those. Religious discrimination, abortion rights, gay rights, Islam, and the suppression of religious expression in the public square. Why do you mention Islam?
Well, one of the biggest challenges today is the rise of minority religious faiths, non-Christian religious faiths. And for many Americans, they're not sure quite how to react to that. But in the book, I argue that part of defending religious freedom means defending it for people of all faiths. And I offer a number of reasons why that is. Number one, all of our religious freedom hangs together. If we undermine it for one faith, it's undermined for all. And ultimately, religious freedom is a fundamental human right. It's how we relate to God, free from government interference. And it's unjust for the government to take away religious freedom, no matter what the faith may be.
Speaking of mandates, which we discussed earlier, the so-called transgender mandate was struck down by a federal judge in Texas. Now, this was attached to an Obama-era rule that would have required doctors to perform sex change operations. How significant is that ruling?
It's very significant. That was our case. I represent Catholic hospitals and Christian doctors across the country. And this regulation would have forced them to violate not only their religious beliefs, but also their medical judgment, because these gender transition procedures, they're highly controversial, and the data shows that in many cases they can actually be harmful. So we went into court and said, not only do these doctors have a religious belief, they also have medical judgment. And the government shouldn't be forcing these doctors to violate their Hippocratic oath to do no harm. So we're very grateful that the judge ruled in our favor, ensuring that doctors can continue practicing medicine in accordance with their judgment.
Luke, you've worked on so many of these high-profile religious freedom cases. What do you see as the most daunting challenge, the stalking horse, if you will, vis-a-vis religious liberty in the days to come?
I think the biggest challenge to religious liberty today is how we're going to handle the potential conflict between gay rights and religious liberty. And you saw this with the comments from Beto on tax-exempt status, but there is a strong current on the left to treat traditional religious beliefs about marriage and sexuality as an immoral form of bigotry and marshal all the power of the state to crush it and punish it. And what we need to do as people of faith is to stand firm in our religious convictions and make the case that government should not be picking sides and crushing traditional religious beliefs, but needs to protect religious freedom and allow religious people to continue doing the good work they've been doing for centuries.
Before I let you go, tell me about this case at the Supreme Court about Title VII, which deals with employment discrimination. What's at stake here?
So the court's hearing 3 cases on employment discrimination, and the question is whether federal law bans employers from discriminating based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And our organization filed a brief in the Supreme Court highlighting the religious liberty implications, which is the fact that hundreds, even thousands of religious organizations across the country have traditional beliefs about human sexuality and expect their employees to live in accordance with those beliefs. So if the Supreme Court in these cases dramatically expands federal employment discrimination law, all of these religious organizations will suddenly be exposed to new lawsuits and new potential liability. So our argument to the court was, don't just unilaterally expand the law in this way, rather give Congress a chance to consider it, because Congress can balance the competing concerns between gay rights and religious freedom.
Wow. Luke, we will check in with you in the days ahead. Luke Goodrich's new book, Free to Believe, The Battle Over Religious Liberty in America, is available at bookstores everywhere. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
That is all the time we have. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. And I have a special announcement. I want to thank my wife of 25 years for putting up with me. Our silver anniversary this week. We're still here, Rebecca. Until then, next week, not 25 years, just next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.